January 1984, 225 Parsons Street, Kalamazoo, Michigan. Mary Lou Hugenboom walks through the finishing room one last time. The smell of nitrocellulose lacquer and rosewood is still there, soaked into the concrete, into the walls, into her. The machines are silent. They had not always been silent. There was a time when this building made over 1,000 guitars every single day, when the name Kalamazoo meant something that no boardroom could manufacture, the sound of Muddy Waters, of Jimmy Page, of an entire century of American music, built by ordinary hands in an ordinary Midwestern city. There was a time when women here secretly kept a guitar empire alive while their husbands shipped off to war, and no one wrote their names down. Not once. Not anywhere. Then one corporate decision ended it all. Not a fire, not a flood, a memo. How does a place that gave the world its sound get erased so quietly? And what happens to the people who refuse to leave? 3 people, 82 years, 15 million instruments, and a building that refused to forget. He never meant to build an empire. He meant to build a perfect instrument. Orville H. Gibson was born in 1856 in Chateauguay, a small town in upstate New York, the kind of place that produces men who are quietly, stubbornly exceptional. He taught himself music. He taught himself woodworking. He taught himself everything because no school existed yet for what he was trying to do. Sometime in the 1880s, following his brother west, he arrived in Kalamazoo, Michigan, a city of 13,000 people, fertile farmland, and, for a self-taught instrument maker with no reputation and no capital, exactly zero obvious opportunity. He took a job as a clerk at Arthur Sprague's shoe store on Burdick Street. He sold shoes by day. By night, he went home and built mandolins. This is where the story of Gibson actually begins. Not in a factory, not in a boardroom, but in a man's private obsession. Orville did not build instruments the way everyone else did. The conventional mandolin of the 1880s was bowl-backed, its body assembled from many bent strips of wood, a design that prioritized ease of construction over quality of sound. Orville rejected this entirely. He carved his instruments from a single solid piece of wood, arched on top, arched on the bottom, the same method used to build violins. He believed the wood needed to vibrate freely without internal bracing, strangling the resonance. He also believed, with a conviction that bordered on the eccentric, that old wood was better than new. He preferred salvaged furniture wood, timber that had already spent decades settling, drying, releasing its tension. His neighbors thought he was unusual. His instruments were extraordinary. By 1896, the shoe store was behind him. Orville opened a small shop at 114 South Burdick, then moved his workshop to the second floor of 104 East Main Street. A single room, lit by whatever daylight came through the window, smelling of wood shavings and hide glue. Output was modest by any industrial standard, 6, maybe 7 instruments a year. Each one built entirely by his hands, entirely to his specifications, entirely on his terms. On February 1st, 1898, the United States Patent Office granted Orville H. Gibson patent number 982245, a single-piece mandolin guitar design unlike anything previously registered. He had spent over a decade arriving at this moment. He was 42 years old and working alone in a room above a street in Michigan. He had no idea what he had just set in motion. In 1902, 5 men came to see him. They were businessmen: Lewis Williams, John Adams, Silvo Reams, Walter Vreeland, and Leroy Hornbeck. And they had a proposition. They would provide the capital. They would build a proper manufacturing facility. They would take Gibson's name, Gibson's designs, and Gibson's methods, and they would scale them into something the market could actually absorb. Orville would serve as a consultant. He would train the workers. He would lend his expertise. What they did not offer him was control. He accepted anyway. In 1904, the Gibson Mandolin Guitar Manufacturing Company was formally incorporated. It is worth pausing on that word, incorporated, because it captures precisely what happened. Orville Gibson's singular vision was absorbed into a legal entity. His name stayed. His authority did not. Under the terms of the agreement, he received a monthly payment and the title of consultant. He was, in the most polite possible language, a man being managed out of his own invention. For a few years he stayed. He trained the workers. He watched the company move to larger premises at 523 East Harrison Court, the mandolin orchestra craze sweeping American parlors, and creating demand his single room could never have met. The business was succeeding. The name Gibson was spreading. And Orville Gibson himself was becoming, within his own company, increasingly invisible. By 1909, he was gone. He moved back to New York, the state where he had started, the state he had left decades earlier, with nothing but a talent and a direction. The records from this period are sparse. What is known is that he lived in a sanitarium in Ogdensburg, New York, suffering from a neurological condition his contemporaries called Bright's disease, a catch-all diagnosis that may have masked something more complex. He composed music. He wrote letters. He watched from a distance as the company that bore his name continued to grow without him. On August 21, 1918, Orville Gibson died in Ogdensburg. He was 62 years old. The obituaries were modest. The guitar world barely noticed. The company named after him did not pause. Here is the thing that history asks us to sit with. By the time Orville Gibson died, the building at 225 Parsons Street was already under construction. The factory that would eventually employ nearly 1,000 workers, produce 1,000 instruments a day, and shape the sound of rock and roll across 5 continents. That factory was being built using his principles, his methods, his name, while he died alone in upstate New York, uncelebrated and largely forgotten by the institution he had created. The room at 104 East Main Street is long gone. The second-floor workshop where one man and his salvaged furniture would, and his stubborn refusal to build things the easy way, none of it survived. What survived was the name above the door of a concrete factory on Parsons Street, and the question that name would spend the next 66 years refusing to answer. Whose Gibson exactly was good enough? The building went up in 1917, and it was built to last. Architect George Gilbert Warden designed it in the daylight factory style, a philosophy of industrial construction that was, at its core, a philosophy of light. Concrete walls, steel-framed windows running floor to ceiling on every side, no dark corners, no gas lamps, no shadows where imprecision could hide. The idea was simple. If the workers could see clearly, they would build more carefully. At 225 Parsons Street, Kalamazoo, Michigan, the Gibson Mandolin Guitar Manufacturing Company had finally given itself a home worthy of its ambitions. The building occupied an entire city block. It would eventually expand to cover 120,000 square feet across 11 additions. But in 1917, standing in that original 3-story concrete shell, breathing air that already smelled faintly of sawdust and lacquer, the men who ran the company believed they had built something permanent. They were right about the building. They were wrong about almost everything else. The problem arrived quietly, the way most problems do. Through the 1910s, the mandolin had been the instrument of American aspiration. Middle-class families gathered in parlors to play Gibson mandolins in organized ensembles the company called Gibson orchestras, a brilliant piece of marketing that turned instrument ownership into social membership. By the early 1920s, that world was dissolving. Jazz was coming, radio was coming. The parlor orchestra was giving way to something louder, faster, and considerably less genteel. Mandolin sales collapsed. Gibson, which had built its entire identity around the instrument, faced a choice that every great industrial company eventually faces. Adapt or follow your original product into irrelevance. They adapted. Banjos came first, then ukuleles, as the company chased the shifting currents of American popular taste. But the more consequential pivot happened in the guitar workshop, and it happened not with a new product, but with a new technology. In 1922, Gibson engineer Thaddeus McHugh developed and patented the adjustable truss rod, a steel reinforcement bar running through the neck of a guitar, allowing the neck's curvature to be precisely controlled and corrected. It sounds, described plainly, like a minor technical improvement. It was not. Before the truss rod, guitar necks warped, bowed, and fought against the constant tension of their strings. Action became unplayable. Instruments aged badly. The truss rod solved this. It gave guitar necks structural memory. It is, to this day, standard on virtually every steel string guitar manufactured anywhere in the world. Gibson invented it in Kalamazoo, in that concrete building on Parsons Street, and quietly changed how every guitar on earth is built. By the late 1920s, guitars had become the company's future. But the future arrived alongside the worst economic collapse in American history. The Great Depression hit Gibson the way it hit everything, suddenly and without mercy. Consumer spending on musical instruments fell off a cliff. The grand arch-top guitars that Gibson had begun developing for professional musicians were simply beyond what most Americans could afford to think about, let alone purchase. The company's response was pragmatic to the point of bluntness. In 1933, they launched a separate budget line called Kalamazoo, stripped-down instruments sold under a different name, cheap enough to survive a Depression-era income, good enough to keep the factory running. It was an act of institutional survival dressed up as a product launch. The workers on Parsons Street kept their jobs. The company kept its doors open. And then, almost immediately, Gibson did something that made no sense at all, which is to say, it made perfect sense. In 1934, 1 year into producing the most affordable instruments in its history, Gibson introduced the Super 400, named for its unprecedented $400 price tag, a sum that, in Depression-era America, represented months of wages for an ordinary worker. The Super 400 was a 18-inch archtop acoustic guitar of almost operatic ambition. The workmanship was immaculate. The appointments were lavish. The sound was unlike anything the American guitar market had produced. It was designed for professional orchestra players and jazz band leaders who needed volume, projection, and an instrument that announced the moment it entered a room that its owner was serious. The Super 400 and the Kalamazoo budget guitar existed simultaneously in the same building, built by the same workers, under the same roof. This contradiction was not an accident. It was a portrait of what Parsons Street had become, a facility capable of operating at every register of the market at once, from the Depression price to the extravagant, from the functional to the magnificent. Outside, Kalamazoo was a mid-sized Midwestern city working its way through hard times. Inside 225 Parsons Street, men with hand tools and trained eyes were making instruments that would eventually end up in the hands of the most recorded musicians in history. Though in 1934, nobody in that building could have known that. They were simply doing their work, shift by shift, room by room, in a concrete building with very large windows and very good light. They were building more than guitars. They were building the infrastructure of an American sound, one that was still finding its shape, still searching for the instrument that would give it a voice the whole world could hear. That instrument did not yet exist. It was 18 years away, and it would change everything. But before it arrived, the factory had a war to survive, and this time, it would not be the men who kept it running. The letters started arriving in 1941, and the factory felt them before management ever acknowledged them. A man would come in on a Monday. By Friday, he was gone, inducted, enlisted, shipped to a processing center somewhere south or east, his workbench cleaned out, his locker emptied. Then another. Then another. The draft moved through the factory floor at 225 Parsons Street the way it moved through every American workplace that year, methodically, without sentiment, indifferent to what it left behind. By the time the United States formally entered World War II in December 1941, Gibson was facing a problem that no product pivot or budget line could solve. The hands that built the instruments were disappearing, and the instruments still needed to be built. The solution Gibson arrived at was practical, effective, and, for reasons that would not become clear for another 6 decades, kept almost entirely secret. They hired women. More than 200 of them came through the doors of 225 Parsons Street over the course of the war years. They came from Kalamazoo and the surrounding towns, from families who needed the income, from a generation of American women who had been told all their lives that factory work was not their domain and who stepped into it anyway because the country needed them to. They learned the work the way all Gibson workers learned it, by doing it, station by station, department by department, under the instruction of the few experienced craftsmen who had remained behind. They learned to sand guitar tops by hand, feeling for imperfections too small to see. They learned to file frets, to fit fingerboards, to apply the nitrocellulose lacquer that gave a Gibson its particular gleam. They learned, in other words, to build guitars, and then they built them, thousands of them, year after year for the duration of the war. The instruments they made carried a mark that distinguished them from everything Gibson had produced before. A small gold banner printed on the headstock, just below the tuning pegs, bearing the words, "Only a Gibson is good enough." These became known as the Banner guitars, acoustics built between 1942 and 1945, during the precise window when American men were fighting in the Pacific and in Europe, and the American women on Parsons Street were keeping a guitar company alive. Woody Guthrie played a Banner guitar. Buddy Holly played a Banner guitar. Musicians who shaped the American folk and rock and roll canon played instruments that came out of this factory during these years, built by these hands. And not one of those instruments said anywhere on it who had actually made it. The factory itself had shifted its identity along with its workforce. Gibson contributed to the war effort through more than just morale. The Parsons Street facility retooled portions of its production to manufacture glider skids for military aircraft, electrical and mechanical radar assemblies, and precision machine gun rods. For this, the company received the Army-Navy E Award for Production Excellence, not once, but 3 times. The award recognized factories that had demonstrated exceptional contribution to the war effort. Gibson won it, and the women working inside it made that possible, and the award went to the company. Their names went nowhere. In 1945, the war ended. The men came home, and at 225 Parsons Street, with a speed that should have been remarkable but apparently struck no one as worthy of comment, the women stepped back. Some left voluntarily, returning to domestic lives the war had temporarily suspended. Others were simply let go. Their wartime necessity evaporated now that the returning veterans needed work. The transition was treated as a restoration of natural order. There were no ceremonies, no commendations, no acknowledgement in the company's internal records that the workforce had spent 4 years being almost entirely female, or that those women had manufactured somewhere in the region of 25,000 instruments that would go on to be played by some of the most significant musicians of the 20th century. The Kalamazoo Gals, the name given to them, eventually by history, were erased almost before the ink on the peace treaties was dry. For 60 years, they stayed erased. The official histories of Gibson mentioned the war years briefly, noted the E Awards, and moved on. Collectors sought out Banner guitars for their exceptional tone. Instruments from this period are now worth tens of thousands of dollars at auction, without knowing, because there was no way to know, that the hands behind them belonged to women who had never been credited. The company that named itself after a man who had been written out of his own story had now written out 200 more people with the same institutional ease. The truth surfaced through the work of writer John Thomas, who dug into Gibson's wartime production records and found what the official narrative had buried: the workforce, the instruments, the numbers. Nearly 25,000 guitars built by women during the war years, a chapter of American industrial and musical history that had been sitting in the archives unread for half a century. It was 1953 when Mary Lou Hugenboom first walked through the doors of 225 Parsons Street. She was hired into the factory 8 years after the war ended, 8 years after the women who preceded her had gone home without a word of thanks. She knew nothing about them. Nobody had told her. Nobody had told anyone. She took her station, learned her work, and began what would become a 31-year career in a building whose most important wartime secret she would not learn until she was an old woman. She was not alone in her ignorance. The factory had a way of keeping its own history, generous with noise and labor and craft, silent about everything else. That silence, it turned out, was only beginning. It arrived in 1952, and nothing in American music was quite the same afterward. The Les Paul was not the first solid-body electric guitar ever made. That distinction belongs to instruments that came before it, built by inventors and tinkerers working in garages and workshops through the 1940s. But it was the first one that felt inevitable, the first one that looked like the future, the first one that a musician could pick up and immediately understand, without instruction, that this was not an evolution of something old. It was the beginning of something entirely new. The story of how it came to be built on Parsons Street is more complicated than the name on the headstock suggests. Les Paul, born Lester William Polsfuss, a Wisconsin-born guitarist and inventor of genuine brilliance, had been advocating for a solid-body electric guitar design for years. He had brought an early prototype to Gibson in the late 1940s and been rejected. The market wasn't ready, the company believed. The idea was too radical, too far from the archtop acoustic tradition that Gibson had spent 30 years perfecting. They sent him away. Then Fender released the Telecaster in 1950, and the market made its position clear without being asked. Gibson moved fast. Ted McCarty, who had become company president in 1950 and would prove to be one of the most consequential figures in the instrument's history, led the development team that designed what would become the Les Paul model. The guitar that emerged from Parsons Street in 1952 was a mahogany-bodied, single-cutaway, solid-body electric with a carved maple top. A design decision that carried a deliberate echo of the archtop tradition Gibson knew best, now applied to something fundamentally different. Two P90 single-coil pickups, a stud bridge, a headstock that angled back at the same pitch Orville Gibson had established in his mandolin designs half a century earlier. Les Paul's actual contribution to the final design remains a point of historical debate. He lent his name, his endorsement, and his reputation, which in the early 1950s was considerable, his recordings with singer Mary Ford having made him one of the most recognizable musicians in America. The trapeze tailpiece on the original 1952 model was reportedly his suggestion, and reportedly something he almost immediately wanted changed. By 1953, it had been replaced. But none of this diminished what had been built on Parsons Street, an instrument of extraordinary character, produced in that concrete building by the same workforce that had been making archtop jazz guitars and Depression-era budget instruments and wartime banner guitars for decades. The sound of the Les Paul was unlike anything those workers had sent out the door before. Where an acoustic guitar's tone bloomed and decayed in the open air, the solid mahogany body of the Les Paul sustained, held notes longer, pushed them further, gave a player the sense that the guitar was fighting alongside them rather than simply responding to them. The P90 pickups translated every nuance of that sustain into electrical signal with a clarity and warmth that suited the amplified music beginning to dominate American culture. It was, in the language of the people who would eventually play it, a thick sound, a singing sound, a sound that wanted to be turned up. In 1957, Gibson introduced the humbucker pickup, developed by engineer Seth Lover to eliminate the electrical hum that plagued single-coil designs, and retrofitted it to the Les Paul standard. The result, known to collectors simply as the Wanderer 57 Les Paul, produced a tone so particular, so unmistakably itself, that it would still be the most sought-after electric guitar sound in the world 70 years later. Jimmy Page recorded the entirety of Led Zeppelin's catalog through a 1959 Les Paul Standard built at 225 Parsons Street. Eric Clapton played a 1960 Les Paul Standard, a Kalamazoo guitar, during his years with John Mayall's Blues Breakers, and the recordings from that period are still used as reference points for what an electric guitar can sound like at its most expressive. Keith Richards, Duane Allman, Peter Green, the list of musicians who built their sound around instruments made in that Michigan factory is not a list of enthusiasts. It is a list of architects. Also in 1957, Gibson acquired the Epiphone Guitar Company, transferring production from Philadelphia to Parsons Street. The Kalamazoo facility, already running at significant capacity, absorbed an entire second brand's manufacturing operation. The building expanded again. New departments opened. The workforce grew. What had begun as one man's workshop above a Kalamazoo street was now one of the most productive instrument manufacturing operations in the world. The women who had built the Banner guitars a decade earlier had made this possible, had kept the factory alive long enough to reach this moment, and they were not there to see it. The men who were there, building Les Paul and ES-335s and J-45 acoustics under the daylight windows of 225 Parsons Street, were about to discover what it felt like to be at the absolute center of the world. There is a number that defines the peak of what Parsons Street became, and it is almost impossible to hold in the mind without stopping to think about what it actually means. 1,000 guitars, every single day, not 1,000 guitars a week or a month. 1,000 guitars in a single working day, produced by a workforce of nearly 1,000 people operating across a 120,000 square foot building that had by the late 1960s expanded to fill an entire city block. If you stood on Parsons Street on a weekday morning in 1965 and watched the workers arrive for the first shift, you were watching the largest and most productive guitar manufacturing operation in the history of American music assembling itself for another day of work. They came on foot and by car from Kalamazoo neighborhoods where Gibson wages had bought houses and raised families. They clocked in, pulled on their aprons, and disappeared into the building. Mary Lou Hugenboom had been there since 1953. By the mid-1960s, she knew every room in the building the way a person knows their own house, by feel as much as by sight. She had worked rim lining, hand sanding, electronics, assembly. She had moved between departments as the factory's needs shifted, accumulating the kind of layered knowledge that only comes from years of physical proximity to a craft. She knew which machines ran hot in summer. She knew which wood shipments were better than others before anyone had told her. She knew the sound of the building, the particular pitch of the belt sanders on the upper floors, the rhythm of the buffing wheels, the hiss of lacquer spray booths. The way you know the sounds of a place that has become as familiar as your own heartbeat. The factory floor of 225 Parsons Street in the 1960s was, by any measure, a remarkable environment. Raw lumber entered at one end of the process, maple, mahogany, rosewood, spruce, and was dried, graded, and rough cut in the wood shop. Guitar tops were carved and braced. Backs and sides were shaped. Necks were cut, profiled, fitted with truss rods. Gibson's own invention, still doing its job 4 decades after McHugh had patented it. Fingerboards were slotted, radiused, and bound. Bodies were routed for pickups, assembled, sanded through successive grits until the wood surface was smooth enough to accept the finish coats that would give each guitar its final appearance. Binding was applied by hand. Frets were pressed, filed, and polished. Electronics were wired and soldered. Hardware was fitted. And through all of it, at every station, there were people, experienced, skilled, and in many cases, fiercely proud of what their hands produced. The culture of the factory in these years was, by every account left behind in oral history, something close to a community. Workers bowled together on the Gibson League team. They ate lunch at the taverns that had established themselves within walking distance of Parsons Street specifically because 1,000 employed people needed somewhere to go on their lunch break. Families spread across the building, a mother in finishing, a son in the wood shop, a neighbor's daughter in electronics. Second-generation Gibson workers were not unusual. In a city the size of Kalamazoo, the factory was not merely a major employer. It was a civic institution, and what those workers were producing was being heard around the world. The guitars that left 225 Parsons Street in the 1960s traveled to recording studios in Los Angeles and London. They were played at the Newport Folk Festival and the Fillmore West in clubs in Hamburg, where a generation of British musicians were learning their craft. They were on the records that defined the sound of the decade. Blues records, folk records, the first waves of rock and roll that were crashing through every cultural boundary that American music had built. Muddy Waters played a Gibson, Pete Townshend played a Gibson. The workers who built those instruments had never left Michigan, would never stand on those stages, would never hear the records played in the rooms where they were recorded. They knew their work only as objects. Guitar-shaped, lacquer gleaming, packed into cases and shipped out the loading dock before it became sound. This is the distance that industrial production places between the maker and the meaning of what they make. The person who sanded the top of the guitar that Jimmy Page played on Whole Lotta Love had no way of knowing that was where their work would end up. They went home that evening, had dinner, went to sleep, and came back the next morning to sand another top. 1,000 guitars a day, and then slowly the number began to fall. The late 1960s brought the first signs of what would become a crisis. Guitar sales nationally began to decline as musical taste shifted and the initial explosion of rock and roll consumer demand began to plateau. The baby boomers who had flooded music stores in the early part of the decade were growing up, buying fewer instruments, spending their money elsewhere. By the early 1970s, foreign manufacturers, Japanese companies producing credible instruments at prices American factories could not match, were taking market share with a speed that alarmed the entire domestic guitar industry. Gibson responded with cost-cutting. Management responded with consolidation. And somewhere above both of these responses, a corporate transaction was quietly reshaping the identity of the company itself, in ways that the workers at 225 Parsons Street would not fully understand until it was far too late. The factory floor still hummed. The guitars still moved down the line. But the hands making decisions about the future of Parsons Street were no longer the hands of people who had ever made anything. That, as it turned out, made all the difference. The first time Gibson was sold, most of the workers on Parsons Street didn't notice. In 1944, the Chicago Musical Instruments Company, known in the industry simply as CMI, acquired Gibson outright. The transaction was quiet, efficient, and on the surface entirely unremarkable. CMI was a legitimate music industry operation with distribution networks and business infrastructure that Gibson, still a relatively regional manufacturer despite its growing reputation, genuinely needed. Production continued. The building on Parsons Street continued. The guitars continued. For the workers clocking in every morning on the first shift, the change in ownership registered about as much as a change in the weather. Something happening above them, beyond them, entirely outside the jurisdiction of the factory floor. For a while this was accurate. The post-war years and the boom of the 1950s papered over any friction between the new corporate ownership and the craftsmen who actually made the instruments. When the factory is producing its most celebrated work, when the Les Paul is flying out the loading dock and the ES-335 is being played by every serious jazz and blues guitarist in America, questions of ownership feel abstract. The work justifies itself. Then 1969 arrived, and nothing was abstract anymore. In that year, CMI was acquired by a Panama-based conglomerate called the Ecuadorian Company Limited, which promptly renamed itself the Norlin Corporation. The name meant nothing to the workers at 225 Parsons Street. The implications meant everything. Norlin was not a music company. It was a multinational industrial conglomerate with interests spanning brewing, construction materials, and electronic components. Its relationship to guitar manufacturing was the relationship of a landlord to a tenant, interested in the rent, indifferent to what happened inside the rooms. Decisions about how Gibson instruments were made, what materials went into them, and what standards governed their production were now being made by executives in corporate offices who had never held a chisel or run their thumb across a fret to check its levelness. The results were not long in coming. Through the early and mid-1970s, cost reduction initiatives began moving through the Gibson product line with the impersonal efficiency of a corporate mandate. Some changes were subtle: wood grades that were acceptable but not exceptional, finishing processes that were adequate but not meticulous. Others were more significant. Construction methods that had fine Gibson instruments for decades were altered or abandoned in the name of production efficiency. The three-piece maple necks that appeared on many models replaced the single-piece mahogany that players had come to trust. Weight relief routing changed the resonant character of bodies that collectors had spent years learning to identify by feel. The instruments still carried the Gibson name. The instruments still looked to the untrained eye like Gibson instruments. But the guitar community, the players, the collectors, the people who spent serious money and serious attention on these instruments, began to notice. The phrase that emerged from this period, spoken in guitar shops and at instrument fairs, and eventually in every serious conversation about vintage instruments, was Norlin-era Gibson. It was not a compliment. It became, in time, a warning. A 1959 Les Paul Standard, built at 225 Parsons Street under the watch of Ted McCarty, was, and remains, one of the most valuable and sought-after electric guitars ever produced. A 1975 Les Paul Deluxe, built in the same building under Norlin management, was a different proposition entirely. Same name, same address, profoundly different instrument. The workers on the factory floor understood this. They were not making inferior guitars because they lacked the skill to make better ones. They were making inferior guitars because the people who owned the building had decided that inferior was sufficient. This distinction, between what the craftsmen were capable of and what the corporation permitted was the source of a tension that eventually broke into open conflict. Marvin Lamb had been at Parsons Street long enough to have known the difference in his hands. He had risen through the factory's hierarchy to the position of plant superintendent, a man who understood the building's operations from the wood shop to the shipping dock, who knew every department's rhythm and every worker's capability, who had watched Gibson instruments get better and then watched them get worse and understood precisely why each had happened. He was not a man given to sentimentality about corporate structure. He was a practical man, a factory man, someone who measured the world in tolerances and production runs and the specific weight of a properly cured mahogany blank. But he was also a man who knew what a Gibson was supposed to be, and he was watching that knowledge become increasingly irrelevant to the people making decisions above him. The workers, for their part, reached their own breaking point through a different route. Wages had not kept pace with inflation. The cost-cutting that was degrading the instruments was not being redirected toward the people building them. The United Auto Workers Union, which represented the Gibson workforce, brought its members out on strike, and the picket line that formed outside 225 Parsons Street was a sight that the neighborhood had never seen before. Men and women who had spent their careers building the instruments that soundtracked American culture stood outside the building in the Michigan cold, holding signs, because the corporation that owned the building had decided their labor was worth less than the market said it was. The strike was eventually resolved. The workers went back inside. The guitars kept moving down the line, but something had changed in the relationship between the factory and the company whose name was on the door. The workers at 225 Parsons Street had always understood, on some level, that they were employees rather than owners. What the Norland years made undeniable was that they were employees of people who viewed the factory not as a craft institution with a legacy worth protecting, but as a cost center on a balance sheet, a problem to be managed rather than a place to be proud of. Marv Lamb stood in the superintendent's office and watched the quarterly reports arrive from people who had never set foot on the factory floor, and he understood something that he could not yet say out loud. The building on Parsons Street was living on borrowed time. He was right. The decision had already been made. It simply hadn't been announced yet. The announcement, when it finally came, was framed as an expansion. In 1974, Norland Corporation broke ground on a new Gibson production facility in Nashville, Tennessee. The official narrative was straightforward. Growing demand required additional capacity, and Nashville, with its deep roots in American music, its infrastructure, its central geography, was a logical location for a second plant. The press materials were optimistic. The language was corporate and careful and said almost nothing about what was actually happening. What was actually happening was simpler and considerably less flattering. Kalamazoo, Michigan, was a union town. The workers at 225 Parsons Street were represented by the United Auto Workers, one of the most organized and effective labor unions in the country. They had wages that reflected decades of collective bargaining, benefits that had been fought for and won through exactly the kind of conflict that had put them on the picket line in the years prior. From the perspective of a Panama-based conglomerate managing a guitar company as a line item on a diversified balance sheet, this was not a workforce. It was a cost structure. And Nashville, in the right-to-work state of Tennessee, where labor organizing faced far greater legal and cultural obstacles, offered a cost structure that looked very different on a quarterly report. The Nashville plant was not built to supplement Kalamazoo. It was built to replace it. The people inside 225 Parsons Street would not be told this directly, not for years, because there was no good way to tell 1,000 skilled workers that the corporation which owned their building had decided their wages were the problem. The process that followed was a slow-motion dismantling, and it was worse in many ways than a sudden closure would have been. Between 1976 and 1984, production at Kalamazoo was shifted to Nashville by degrees. Not all at once. That would have been too obvious, too brutal, too difficult to explain. Instead, it happened the way a tide goes out. Gradually, then unmistakably. A department would be reduced. A product line would be transferred. The number of workers on the first shift would be smaller than the week before, and then smaller again. And the reason given was always some variation of restructuring, realignment, operational efficiency. The vocabulary of corporate decision-making that means everything and explains nothing. Workers who had been at Parsons Street for a decade, for 2 decades, for their entire adult working lives began doing the arithmetic in their heads and arriving at conclusions they didn't want to reach. Marv Lamb was not doing arithmetic. He already knew the answer. As plant superintendent, he was not insulated from the decisions. He was the instrument through which they were executed. When Nashville needed equipment, it was Lamb's responsibility to oversee the transfer. When a production line was discontinued at Kalamazoo, it was Lamb who managed the shutdown. He had spent years building and maintaining the operational infrastructure of 225 Parsons Street, understanding which machines needed calibration, which workflows produced the best results, which combinations of workers and stations and timing generated the quality that the Gibson name was supposed to represent. Now he was being asked to dismantle it, not quickly, not cleanly, but piece by piece, shipment by shipment, over the course of nearly a decade. He did his job, because that is what you do when you are a factory man, and the factory still has people depending on it, and walking away serves no one. But doing his job did not require him to be unaware of what his job had become. Mary Lou Hugenboom watched it from the factory floor. She had been at Parsons Street since 1953, longer than many of her colleagues had been alive. And she had the particular sensitivity of someone who has spent 3 decades in a place to the changes that outsiders would never notice. She noticed them all: the woodshop getting quieter, the shipping dock handling fewer outgoing crates, the faces that disappeared from the lunch tables and were not replaced, the buildings on the block that had always been full going dark one by one. They moved the machines, she would say years later, in an interview that carries the flatness of someone describing something they still haven't entirely made peace with. Then they moved the people, and then there was nothing left to move. The trucks arrived regularly through the late 1970s and into the 1980s. Long flatbed trailers would pull up outside 225 Parsons Street, and the equipment that had produced some of the most significant instruments in American music history would be wrapped in moving blankets, strapped down, and driven south. The belt sanders that Mary Lou had worked alongside for decades, the lacquer spray booths, the presses and routers and the specialized jigs that Gibson craftsmen had developed over generations to produce specific cuts and curves that could not easily be replicated without them. All of it heading to Tennessee. All of it leaving Kalamazoo. The city felt it. Kalamazoo was not a large city, and 225 Parsons Street had never been simply a factory. It had been an economic anchor, a source of identity, the place you pointed to when someone asked what Kalamazoo made and why it mattered. The ripple effects of the withdrawal spread through the surrounding neighborhoods with the quiet persistence of water finding its level. The taverns near the factory lost their lunch crowds. The workers who had bought houses on Gibson wages began to wonder about their mortgages. The second-generation employees who had followed their parents through those doors found themselves holding jobs that were visibly, undeniably temporary. By 1981, Gibson had moved its corporate headquarters to Nashville. The move was symbolic only in the sense that the reality it reflected had been underway for years. The company's center of gravity had already shifted south. What remained at Parsons Street was a diminished operation, running on institutional momentum and the skill of workers who had nowhere else to take what they knew. The last guitars built at Kalamazoo were completed in 1984. They were made well because the people who made them did not know how to make them any other way. Then the line stopped. The orders stopped. The shifts stopped. And for the first time since 1917, the building on Parsons Street had nothing left to do. Except it did, because Marv Lamb was still there, and he had already decided that Nashville was not going to be the end of the story. January 1984. The last morning. It arrived the way all last mornings do, indistinguishable at first from any other. The sky over Kalamazoo came up gray behind the rooftops of Parsons Street, the particular flat gray of a Michigan winter that carries no promise and makes no apologies. The temperature was in the low 20s. The sidewalks were salted. The street lights were still on when the first workers arrived, their breath visible in the cold. Their footsteps echoing in a way that footsteps on a busy factory block do not ordinarily echo, because a busy factory block absorbs sound, crowds it out with its own noise, its own momentum. A factory that is winding down does not do this. A factory that is winding down lets you hear yourself walking toward it. The building was still standing, as it had stood since 1917. 3 stories of cast-in-place concrete, the steel frame windows running floor to ceiling on every face. The original daylight factory design that George Gilbert Worden had drawn up for a company that believed it was building something permanent. From the outside, 225 Parsons Street looked exactly as it had always looked. The same mass, the same proportion, the same industrial solidity that had made it seem, to everyone who had ever worked inside it, like a thing that could not simply stop. But the loading dock was empty. The trucks that had spent years carrying equipment south to Nashville had already taken what they came for. The production lines that had once generated 1,000 guitars a day were gone. The machines removed, the station stripped, the floor plans that had organized the labor of 1,000 people reduced to open space, and the ghost geometry of bolt holes in the concrete where equipment had been anchored for decades. What remained was the shell, the building without its purpose, the instrument without its strings. The workers who came in that morning came to finish the finishing, to complete whatever final administrative tasks the closure required, to collect personal belongings, to say goodbye to a place that had, for many of them, been as central to their lives as any home they had ever known. They moved through the corridors quietly. There was not much left to say that had not already been said in the months of slow withdrawal that had preceded this day. And there was not much left to do that required the noise and urgency that 225 Parsons Street had always run on. The building accepted their presence with the indifference of a place that has already made its peace with what is happening. Outside, Kalamazoo continued. Traffic moved on the streets. The rest of the city went about its morning. The world did not pause for what was ending on Parsons Street, which is perhaps the most honest thing that can be said about how institutions die. Not with the acknowledgement their significance deserves, but with the ordinary indifference of a world that has already moved on. Mary Lou Hugenboom had been at 225 Parsons Street since 1953, 31 years. She had started when Harry Truman was still in the White House. She had watched the factory absorb the Epiphone operation, watched the Les Paul transform the instrument market, watched the workforce swell to 1,000 people, and then contract department by department, year by year, until what remained on this January morning was a fraction of the institution she had given her working life to. She knew the building the way you know a place you have walked through every day for 3 decades. Not consciously, not as a set of directions, but as a physical knowledge stored in the body. A map that lives in the feet and the hands rather than the mind. She walked through it one last time. The finishing room first. Her room, in the sense that any space becomes yours when you have spent enough hours in it. The lacquer smell was still there, embedded in the walls, in the floor, in the air itself. Nitrocellulose lacquer has a particular presence that does not leave a building easily. It had been applied to tens of thousands of guitar bodies in this room over the decades, and the room had absorbed it all, layer by layer, until the smell was no longer the smell of a chemical, but the smell of the place itself. She stood in it and breathed it in and said nothing. Then the sanding stations, the electronics department, the assembly floor where guitar bodies and necks had been married together and strung and set up and checked, where the last critical judgment about whether an instrument was ready to leave the building had always been made by human hands and human ears rather than by any machine. All of it empty now, all of it stripped of the equipment and the people and the noise that had given it its meaning. What remained were the windows. Those enormous steel-framed daylight windows that Worden had specified in 1917, still doing what they had always done, pulling the gray Michigan light into the building and distributing it evenly across the empty floor. She thought, standing in that light, about the women who had stood in it before her. She had learned about the Kalamazoo gals late. The knowledge had reached her slowly, in fragments, through conversations and articles that had begun to surface as researchers started picking through the wartime record. 200 women, 25,000 instruments. A story that the building had held inside itself for 40 years without telling anyone. She had worked alongside the aftermath of their labor her entire career without knowing they existed. She had sanded surfaces they had prepared, worked machines they had operated, occupied spaces they had occupied. And the building had never said a word. And she thought, though she would not have used this language, about the man who had built the first instrument in a room very different from this one, a room above a Kalamazoo street, lit by a single window smelling of hide glue and wood shavings. Orville Gibson had made 6 or 7 instruments a year in that room, each one by hand, each one entirely on his own terms. He had died in 1918 in a sanitarium in upstate New York, while the factory that bore his name was still under construction. He had never seen these windows, never stood on this floor, never heard the particular sound that 225 Parsons Street made when it was running at full production, that layered industrial music of belt sanders and buffing wheels, and the rhythmic press of fret wire being seated into rosewood slots. 88 years separated his first instrument from this last morning. The circle was closing in a building he had never entered, and the light coming through Worden's daylight windows fell across the empty floor with the same indifference it had always shown, illuminating, equally and without judgment, both the work and the absence of work, both the making and the end of making. Mary Lou Hugenboom walked to the door. Marv Lamb stood in the center of the building and did not move for a long time. As plant superintendent, he had been one of the last people with operational authority over 225 Parsons Street, responsible, in the end, for the closure itself, for the systematic transfer of equipment and personnel that had emptied the building over the preceding years. He had managed it the way he managed everything, methodically, professionally, without visible sentiment. He had done his job because the people who depended on this factory needed someone to do the job until the last possible moment. And walking away before that moment would have served no one. Nashville was waiting for him. Gibson had made that clear. There was a position in Tennessee for a man with his experience, his institutional knowledge, his understanding of what it took to run a guitar production operation at scale. It was a reasonable offer. It was, by any conventional measure, the logical next step. He was not going to take it. The decision had not been made in a moment of drama or defiance. It had been made gradually, the way serious decisions often are, accumulated through months of watching the Kalamazoo operation wind down, through the specific grief of dismantling something he had spent decades building, through a growing conviction that what had been done to Parsons Street was wrong in a way that relocating to Tennessee would not fix, but would, in some small but meaningful sense, ratify. He was a factory man. He believed in making things, and he had come to believe, with the quiet certainty of someone who has thought something through to its conclusion, that what needed to be made was not guitars for Norland Corporation. It was a reason for Kalamazoo to keep making guitars at all. The idea had been forming for months in conversations with colleagues, Jim Durlew, the plant manager, J.P. Moats, others who had spent their careers at Parsons Street and had no intention of surrendering what they knew to a corporate decision made in an office they had never visited. The idea was straightforward. Take whatever machinery Gibson was leaving behind, and there was machinery being left behind, equipment deemed not worth the cost of transporting south, and use it. Use the building, use the knowledge, use the 60-plus years of craft tradition that had accumulated inside these walls and that Nashville could absorb the equipment, but could not absorb, could not package and truck south, could not replicate on a balance sheet, make guitars, their own guitars, in their own building. He did not know, standing in that empty factory on that January afternoon, whether it would work. He did not know whether there was a market for what they planned to make, or whether the capital would hold, or whether the logistics of starting an independent guitar company from scratch inside the shell of a shuttered industrial facility were even remotely manageable. What he knew was that the alternative, letting 225 Parsons Street go silent and staying silent along with it, was not something he was willing to do. He took one more look at the empty floor. Then he walked out to find the others. Mary Lou Hugenboom turned off the lights. She did not make ceremony of it. There was no formal designation, no announcement that she would be the one to do it. It simply fell to her, the way things fall to the person who has been somewhere long enough to have become, in some unofficial but undeniable sense, the custodian of the place. 31 years made her the custodian. She turned off the lights in the finishing room, then the assembly floor, then the departments she had worked in, and the corridors she had walked through, and the spaces she had learned by feel over the course of a working life that had begun when this building was still young. The building went dark, room by room. She would talk about this moment in 2012, nearly 30 years later, in an interview recorded for a Kalamazoo Valley Museum exhibit on Gibson guitars. She is matter-of-fact in the recording for most of it, describing her departments, her colleagues, the work itself, in the practical, unsentimental language of someone who has always understood labor as labor and does not require it to be more than it is. And then she gets to this moment, to January 1984, to the lights going out, and her voice changes. It does not break. It simply stops, briefly, in the way that voices stop when they arrive at something that has not finished being processed, even after 3 decades. She stepped outside. The door to 225 Parsons Street closed behind her. For the first time since 1917, since the year Orville Gibson was still alive, and the building was still being finished, and nobody yet knew what would be made inside it. The factory was silent. The daylight windows, which had pulled Michigan light into the building every morning for 67 years, went dark from the inside. The smell of lacquer and rosewood and fresh-cut maple, that smell that had soaked into the walls over 6 decades of production, that smell that Mary Lou would carry with her in her clothes for days afterward, that smell stayed inside the building with nowhere now to go. Somewhere in Tennessee, a production line that had been built with Kalamazoo's equipment and Kalamazoo's institutional knowledge was preparing for another day's work. Somewhere in upstate New York, in a cemetery in Ogdensburg, a man who had made 6 or 7 instruments a year in a room above a street was still not getting the credit he was owed. And somewhere inside 225 Parsons Street, in the walls, in the floor, in the concrete that had absorbed 67 years of craft and noise and human effort, something that could not be packed onto a truck or transferred to Nashville or written off on a balance sheet was still present, still waiting, still refusing to go anywhere. Marv Lamb was counting on that. They opened for business in 1985 with 5 people, a handful of aging machines, and no particular reason to believe it would work. Marv Lamb, Jim Durlew, J.P. Motes, 2 other former Gibson employees whose names appear less frequently in the record, but whose presence in those first months was no less essential. Bodies in a building that needed bodies, hands in a workshop that needed hands. They called the company Heritage Guitars Incorporated, and they set up operations inside the portion of 225 Parsons Street that Gibson had vacated, in the same rooms where they had spent their careers making instruments for a corporation that had ultimately decided their city was too expensive to stay in. The irony was not lost on them. They did not spend much time on it. There was work to do. The equipment they had access to was what Gibson had left behind. Machinery deemed by Nashville accountants to be not worth the cost of transport, older tooling that had been superseded by newer installations in Tennessee. The industrial residue of a factory closure. In the hands of people who did not know how to use it, this would have been junk. In the hands of Marv Lamb and Jim Durlew and the men who had spent decades operating it, it was a functional guitar workshop. They knew every machine's tendencies, its tolerances, the specific adjustments required to get it running correctly on a cold Michigan morning. The knowledge did not live in the equipment, it lived in the people. The equipment was simply the means through which the knowledge became guitars. What they made from the beginning were instruments that looked and felt and sounded like what Gibson had stopped making. This was not coincidence, and it was not imitation, it was continuity. The people who built Heritage guitars were the same people who had built the best Gibson guitars of the preceding decades, using the same methods, the same wood selection principles, the same attention to the details that separated an instrument worth playing from an instrument worth playing for 50 years. The models that Heritage introduced, the H150, which bore an unmistakable resemblance to the Les Paul, the H535, a thin-line semi-hollow that recalled the ES335, the H575, a full-bodied archtop in the tradition Gibson had pioneered, were not accidents of design. They were deliberate acts of preservation. The Kalamazoo craft tradition continuing in Kalamazoo because the people who carried that tradition had chosen to stay. The guitar world noticed, gradually, the way it notices anything that is genuinely good rather than merely well-marketed. Heritage did not have Gibson's advertising budget. It did not have Gibson's distribution network or its decades of accumulated brand recognition. What it had was the reputation of the people making the instruments, and in a market where serious players and collectors understood that the name on a headstock was only as meaningful as the hands behind it, this turned out to be enough. Word spread through guitar shops and players' networks and the nascent community of instrument enthusiasts that would eventually find each other more efficiently online. That in Kalamazoo, in the old Gibson factory, the people who had made the good ones were still making them. Meanwhile, Gibson itself was in crisis. The Norland years had left the company in a condition that the guitar market had already assessed and found wanting. By the mid-1980s, sales were collapsing. The brand equity that decades of extraordinary instruments had built up had been drawn down to nearly nothing by years of quality decline and corporate indifference. The company that had introduced the Les Paul, the ES-335, the J-45, the Super 400, the company whose instruments had been played by the architects of modern popular music, was by 1985 approaching insolvency. The factory in Nashville was running. The name was still on the headstocks. The guitars were still shipping, but the company was within 3 months of going out of business entirely. In January 1986, Gibson was purchased by Henry Yuskiewicz, David Berryman, and Gary Zabrowski, 3 Harvard Business School graduates who paid less than $10 million for one of the most historically significant names in American manufacturing, $10 million. The company that had defined the sound of rock and roll, that had produced instruments now selling at auction for hundreds of thousands of dollars apiece, was acquired for less than the price of a modest commercial property in a mid-sized American city. It was the final accounting of what the Norland years had cost, not just in quality and reputation, but in the most literal financial terms. Heritage, by contrast, was not in crisis. Heritage was making guitars. The contrast between the two companies through the late 1980s and into the 1990s was not one that generated much mainstream attention. Gibson's recovery under new ownership was a better story, a turnaround narrative with a clear arc and a recognizable brand at its center. Heritage remained what it had always been, a small operation in Kalamazoo, making exceptional instruments for people who understood what they were buying and why it mattered. The H-150 was not a cheap guitar. It was not trying to compete on price. It was trying to compete on the thing that price cannot manufacture: the quality of attention that goes into an instrument when the person making it has spent their entire professional life learning how to make it correctly. Marv Lamb stayed. This is the fact that more than any other defines what Heritage Guitars represented in its early years. Not as a business proposition, but as a statement about what work means to the people who do it well. He had been offered Nashville. He had declined. He had chosen instead to remain in a building that the company he had served for decades had abandoned, to continue making the things he knew how to make in the city where he had made them, for no reason that a corporate balance sheet could capture or a quarterly report could express. He worked at 225 Parsons Street until he could not work anymore. He never moved to Tennessee. He never stopped making guitars. The building held them all: the concrete walls that had gone up in 1917, the daylight windows that George Gilbert Worden had specified to pull Michigan light into the workspace, the floor that had been walked by thousands of workers over 67 years of production. All of it was still there, still standing, still absorbing the work being done inside it. The smell of lacquer and fresh-cut wood that Mary Lou Hugenboom had carried out with her on that January evening in 1984 came back. It always comes back in a building where guitars are being made, because the work itself produces it: the sanding, the spraying, the fitting and the finishing, and the building accepts it back into its walls without complaint. Heritage Guitars did not save 225 Parsons Street. The building did not need saving. It had survived everything that had been done to it and around it, and it would continue to survive. What Heritage did was give the building back its purpose, returned to it the activity that had always been its reason for existing, the specific and irreplaceable human labor of making something that, in the right hands and through the right amplifier, in a room with the right acoustics, could produce a sound that justified everything it had taken to get there. A guitar, made by someone who knew how, in Kalamazoo, where it had always been made. That, in the end, was the answer Marv Lamb had given to the question Norland Corporation had tried to close. In 2022, the United States government decided that 225 Parsons Street was worth remembering. The National Park Service added the Gibson, Incorporated factory and office building to the National Register of Historic Places, a designation that recognizes structures associated with events that have made, in the official language of the registry, a significant contribution to the broad patterns of our history. The building received the designation because of what had been made inside it, and because of what that making had meant to American music and American culture across more than 8 decades of continuous production. It was a formal acknowledgement issued by a federal agency that the concrete building with the steel-framed daylight windows on Parsons Street in Kalamazoo, Michigan, was not simply a former factory. It was a place where history had happened. The workers who had made that history were not there to receive the news. Most of them were gone. Mary Lou Hugenboom, who had started at the factory in 1953 and turned off the lights in 1984 and spent the intervening decades carrying that building inside her, the way you carry any place that has shaped the largest portion of your life. She died in 2019, 3 years before the designation was announced. Marv Lamb was gone. Jim Duerloo was gone. The generation that had lived the history the government was now marking had largely passed out of the world before the world got around to marking it. This is how institutional recognition works. It arrives late, dressed in the language of permanence, for people who needed it when they were alive and living in the middle of what they had no way of knowing was history. The Kalamazoo gals waited even longer. The women who had kept Gibson operating through the Second World War, who had built the banner guitars that Woody Guthrie and Buddy Holly played, who had manufactured the radar assemblies and the glider skids and the machine gun rods that earned the factory 3 Army-Navy E awards, who had done all of this in deliberate obscurity and then been returned to obscurity with the efficiency of an institution that had no further use for them. Those women waited nearly 80 years for the broader world to know their names. The research that surfaced their story, the archival work that established the number of instruments they built, the conditions under which they built them, the specific and unrepeatable contribution they made to a factory and a musical legacy that would not have survived without them. That research came late and came through the persistence of people who believed that history owed these women more than silence. Some of their names are now known, many are not. The banner guitars they built, those acoustics with the gold headstock banner and the words "Only a Gibson is good enough," have been selling at auction for decades, sought out by collectors who understand that instruments from the wartime production period possess something that later Gibsons do not. The tonal qualities of those guitars, the result of the specific woods used during wartime material restrictions and the specific hands that worked them, have made them objects of genuine desire in the vintage instrument market. They sell for tens of thousands of dollars. The names of the women who built them are not on the instruments. They were never on the instruments. They are not in the auction catalogs, not in the collector guides, not in the footnotes of the transactions through which those guitars change hands. What is present in the wood and the lacquer and the particular resonance of a properly preserved banner guitar played through the right amplifier is the work itself. The work is still there. The hands that did it are not. Gibson, the company, survived. After the near collapse of the Norland years and the acquisition in January 1986 for less than $10 million, the new ownership under Henry Yushkevich rebuilt the brand with an aggression and a marketing intelligence that the previous decade had entirely lacked. Production at Nashville expanded. New models were introduced. The vintage reissue program, guitars built to replicate the specifications of the celebrated Kalamazoo-era instruments, the 1959 Les Paul Standard, the 1960 ES-35, became central to Gibson's commercial identity, a corporate acknowledgement encoded in product strategy rather than words That the guitars Nashville was now producing were understood by the market to be iterations of something that had been built better somewhere else, by someone else, in a time that could not be recreated but could be approximated. In May 2018, Gibson filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. The company that had once been sold for $10 million, that had been rebuilt over 3 decades of new ownership into a globally recognized brand with revenues in the hundreds of millions, found itself unable to service the debt that aggressive expansion into consumer electronics had accumulated. It was a different kind of collapse from 1984. No factory closure, no workers standing on picket lines, no trucks driving equipment south in the middle of winter. It was a financial event, managed in courtrooms and through restructuring agreements, and the company emerged from it in November 2018, having shed the consumer electronics divisions that had burdened it and returned its focus to the instruments that had made the name worth anything in the first place. Heritage Guitars was not in bankruptcy. Heritage was in Kalamazoo, making guitars. The company that Marv Lamb and Jim Durlew and J.P. Motes had started in 1985 with 5 people and a collection of aging machines had outlasted the corporate crisis that had made its existence necessary. It had changed over the decades. New ownership arrived in 2016, bringing outside capital and a more deliberate approach to market positioning. But the essential proposition had not changed. Guitars made by hand in the building, where guitars had always been made in Kalamazoo. The H-150 still in production, the H-535 still in production. The full-bodied archtops that recalled the tradition Gibson had pioneered still being built in the rooms where that tradition had been established, by craftsmen working in the light from Worden's daylight windows. Somewhere right now, someone is playing a guitar built at 225 Parsons Street. It might be a Les Paul Standard from 1959, worth more than a house in the neighborhood surrounding the factory. Its sunburst finish aged to something that was never planned but became, over 60 years, exactly what it needed to be. It might be a Banner guitar from 1943, its gold headstock banner still legible, its spruce top still responding to the touch of hands that had nothing to do with the hands that built it. It might be a Heritage H-150 made last year, in that same building, by someone who learned the work from someone who learned it from someone who was there when 1,000 guitars a day was not a memory, but a Monday. The sound that comes out of that guitar, wherever it is, whoever is playing it, carries something that is not captured in any serial number or auction catalog or federal historic designation. It carries the specific character of the wood and the lacquer and the way the frets were set and the way the neck was shaped and the 10,000 small decisions made by human hands that no machine can make and no corporation can own and no balance sheet can record. It carries, without knowing it, the work of a man who died alone in upstate New York in 1918. It carries the work of 200 women whose names were not written down. It carries the work of the people who stayed when leaving would have been easier. A company can be sold. A factory can be closed. A workforce can be dispersed to Tennessee or to history or to the ordinary passage of time that takes everything, eventually, regardless of what it was worth or what it built or how long it stood in the light. But the sound, the specific, unrepeatable sound of what was made in that building by those hands in that city, that sound does not go to Nashville. That sound stays in Kalamazoo. It always did.